Imagine scrolling through YouTube, back when it was simpler or raw, when homemade videos from small-town kids felt like windows into another world. You stumble onto a channel, a young man, bright-eyed, enthusiastic, talking about anime, video games, movies. He's charming. He's relatable. He's the kind of guy you'd want as a neighbor, maybe even a friend. You subscribe, you watch video after video. He feels like someone you know. Now imagine that same young man, the one grinning into a camera with all the awkward sincerity of a small-town dreamer, walking into his family home, one quiet Texas night, and shooting his mother, his father, and his brother dead. One by one, in cold blood. This is not a story ripped from the darkest corners of fiction. This is the story of Trey Sesler, Mr. Anime as his fans knew him, a YouTube personality from Wharton, Texas, who on the night of March 22, 2012, committed one of the most shocking family murders the internet age has ever produced. But here's what makes this case more than just a tragedy. Here's what keeps criminologists, true crime analysts, and ordinary people up at night, dissecting every frame of his videos, every deleted post, every whispered theory. There are dimensions to this case that have never been fully explained, motivations that don't quite add up, behaviors that don't fit neatly into any psychological profile, and a plan so elaborate, so devastating in its ambition, that it goes far beyond what happened inside that Texas home. What you are about to hear will disturb you, not because of the violence alone, but because of how normal everything seemed. Right up until it wasn't. Trey Sesler was not a ghost. He was visible, he was online, he was creating content and building a community, all while something dark was quietly consuming him from the inside out. So before we go any further, before we walk into that house on Avenue D in Wharton, I want you to ask yourself one question. How well do we really know the people we follow online? How well do we know the faces behind the screens? Because in the age of social media, in the age of content creation and digital connection, Trey Sesler was proof that a monster can wear the most ordinary face imaginable. The story begins not with violence, but with a camera, a dream, and a boy who wanted nothing more than to be loved by an audience. And it ends in blood. Let us begin. Wharton, Texas is the kind of place that doesn't make the national news for good reasons. It sits in Wharton County, roughly 60 miles southwest of Houston, a flat, quiet town where the population hovers around 8,000 souls and where the biggest events of any given year are Friday night football games and the occasional county fair. It is, in the truest sense of the word, unremarkable. A town where people are born, grow old, and die often within the same 10 square mile radius. Into this world, James Albert Sesler III was born. He went by Trey, the nickname that would follow him from playground to classroom to internet fame. By most accounts, from those who knew him growing up, Trey was a quiet, introspective kid, the kind who preferred the fictional worlds of anime and manga to the social hierarchies of high school hallways. He was deeply invested in Japanese animation culture at a time when that passion still carried a certain stigma in small-town Texas, when being an anime fan meant sitting alone at lunch tables more often than not. His parents, James Sesler Jr. and Kathy Sesler, were a working-class couple doing their best to raise their two sons. His younger brother Mark was reportedly the more social of the two Sesler boys, more integrated into the rhythms of ordinary Texas teenage life. Trey occupied a different space, internal, imaginative, yearning for something larger than what Wharton could offer. What Wharton could not give him, the internet could. And in the mid-2000s, as YouTube was just beginning to explode into cultural consciousness, Trey Sesler found his stage. He created his channel under the name Mr. Anime, and he threw himself into it with the kind of desperate, wholehearted energy that only the truly isolated can muster. This was not a casual hobby. This was a lifeline. His videos were earnest and unpolished in the way all early YouTube content was. Shaky cameras, poor lighting, occasionally awkward delivery. But there was something genuine in them. He spoke about anime series with real knowledge and passion. He engaged with commenters. He built a modest but loyal following of fans who appreciated his authenticity. For a kid from Wharton, Texas, this was nothing short of miraculous. He was reaching people. He was being seen. What no one watching those early videos could have known was that the quiet, passionate young man behind the camera was already living with pressures, frustrations, and darkness that the YouTube persona of Mr. Anime would never reveal. The gap between the public self and the private self was already beginning to widen, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Understanding who Trey Sesler was in Wharton, Texas before he became a case number in a Texas courtroom is essential, because monsters are not born in a vacuum. They are shaped by places, by families, by the worlds they inhabit and the worlds they desperately wish they could escape. There is a peculiar alchemy to early YouTube stardom. Unlike the polished, monetized, algorithm-optimized content machine that the platform has become, the YouTube of the late 2000s rewarded authenticity above all else. Viewers could smell performance from a mile away, and they gravitated toward creators who seemed genuinely passionate, genuinely unfiltered, genuinely themselves. By that measure, Mr. Anime had something real to offer. Trey Sesler launched his channel and began posting reviews, commentary, and discussions centered on anime, the animated art form from Japan that had been slowly conquering American youth culture through series like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, Bleach, and Death Note. He was knowledgeable, he was opinionated, and he communicated with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that made viewers feel they were talking with a friend rather than watching a broadcaster. His subscriber count grew. Not viral numbers, not the kind that launches careers overnight, but steady, consistent growth that reflected a genuinely engaged audience. People came for the anime content and stayed for Trey himself. Comment sections on his videos were filled with the particular warmth of early internet community. Inside jokes, debates about favorite series, expressions of gratitude from lonely viewers in other small towns who recognized in Mr. Anime someone who understood them. Trey leaned into it. He experimented with different formats, reviews, top 10 lists, reaction videos, personal vlogs. He was building something. He could see a path from Wharton, Texas to something larger, and that path ran directly through the camera lens pointed at his face in his bedroom. YouTube was not just entertainment for Trey Sesler. It was his way out, but there were cracks forming beneath the surface, even as the channel grew. People who knew Trey in person described a growing disconnection between his online persona and his daily reality. He was struggling academically. His social world remained narrow. The dreams that YouTube seemed to promise, fame, success, escape, were not materializing as fast as he needed them to. And Trey Sesler, it would become clear, was not a patient man. He began to speak differently in some of his later videos. The enthusiasm remained, but there was an edge creeping into his content, an intensity that occasionally made viewers slightly uncomfortable without being able to articulate exactly why. Looking back now, frame by frame, comment by comment, those videos read like a map of a mind beginning to fracture. Not all at once, but steadily, inexorably, like a fault line deepening beneath the quiet landscape. The subscribers kept watching. They kept commenting. They kept engaging with Mr. Anime, the boy from Texas who loved anime and just wanted to be seen. None of them could have imagined what they were actually watching build, one video at a time. When detectives and digital forensics experts began combing through Trey Sesler's YouTube channel in the weeks following the murders, what they found sent a chill through everyone who reviewed the footage. The videos were all still there, archived, time-stamped, publicly available for anyone to watch. And when viewed through the lens of what Trey had done, they became something profoundly disturbing. A confession delivered slowly, openly, over months and years, to an audience that never quite heard what was being said. Certain videos stood out immediately. In several uploads from the months preceding the murders, Trey made references that investigators would later identify as direct foreshadowing of violent ideation. He spoke about fictional characters who killed their families. He discussed with analytical detachment the psychology of people who commit extreme violence. He referenced real-world mass casualty events with a kind of clinical interest that, in retrospect, was not intellectual curiosity. It was something else entirely. More disturbing still were the personal vlogs, the videos in which Trey spoke directly to the camera about his life, his frustrations, his sense of being trapped in Wharton, his feeling that the world owed him more than it was delivering. These were not the ramblings of an obviously unhinged individual. They were the articulate grievances of a young man who felt profoundly cheated by existence, and who was increasingly framing that grievance in terms that pointed toward a violent resolution. There was one particular video, which investigators and journalists who have covered this case have referenced repeatedly, in which Trey discussed a category of real-world violence with a level of engagement that should have been alarming to anyone paying close enough attention. He spoke about planning, he spoke about timing, he spoke about what it would take for someone to reach the point of doing something irreversible. His fans in the comment section largely read these videos as edgy humor, as the kind of dark comedy that internet culture had normalized, as the performative nihilism that was practically a genre requirement for young male content creators at the time. Very few people watching understood that they were seeing something genuine. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the Trey Sesler case, the documentation. Unlike many killers who leave behind only fragmented evidence of their deterioration, Trey Sesler literally filmed his descent. He uploaded it. He titled the videos, added descriptions, and tagged them so the algorithm could find them. The record is there, explicit and devastating for anyone with the will to watch. The question that lingers, the question that keeps this case alive in the minds of true crime analysts and internet historians alike, is deceptively simple. Was anyone actually watching? Was anyone paying the kind of attention that could have changed what happened on March 22, 2012? The answer, tragically, appears to be no. To understand the full weight of what Trey Sesler did, you must understand who he took it from. The 3 people killed inside that Wharton home on a March night were not abstractions. They were a family, flawed, ordinary, and entirely undeserving of the fate that came for them. James Sesler Jr., Trey's father, was a man defined by his work and his obligations. Those who knew him described a hard-working, traditional Texan father who wanted stability for his family above all else. He had opinions about how his sons should live their lives, and he expressed those opinions with the directness common to men of his generation and background. The relationship between James Sr. and Trey was, by multiple accounts, complicated, marked by the particular tension that develops between a father with conventional expectations and a son whose passions and ambitions run in unconventional directions. Kathy Sesler, Trey's mother, occupied that painful middle space that many mothers of difficult sons understand intimately, caught between loyalty to her child and concern for what that child was becoming. She was, by all accounts, a devoted and loving mother who maintained her relationship with Trey even as tensions within the household grew. Friends of the family have spoken about her warmth, her patience, her unwillingness to give up on her eldest son. Mark Sesler, Trey's younger brother, is perhaps the most heartbreaking figure in this story. He was just 19 years old when he died, still at the beginning of everything, still building whatever life was going to be his. Mark was reportedly well-liked, more socially integrated than his older brother, and by some accounts was close with Trey in the complicated, ambivalent way that brothers often are. A mixture of genuine affection and accumulated resentment, of shared history and diverging trajectories. Accounts from people who knew the Sesler family paint a picture of a household that was strained but not uniquely dysfunctional. There were arguments. What family doesn't have them? There were disagreements about Trey's direction, his YouTube ambitions, his apparent unwillingness to pursue more traditional paths. There was the ordinary friction of multiple adults sharing a small space in a small town. None of this explains what happened. That is crucial to understand. Difficult family dynamics are extraordinarily common. Friction between parents and adult children is universal. The vast majority of families that experience exactly what the Seslers experienced never produce a Trey Sesler. The friction alone does not account for the violence. Something else was operating inside Trey Sesler. Something more profound, more broken, more catastrophic. And the family dynamic was at most one ingredient in a formula for disaster that we still do not entirely understand. What we know with certainty is this. On March 22, 2012, James Sesler Jr., Kathy Sesler, and Mark Sesler were alive. By morning, they were gone, and the person who took them had been living under the same roof, eating at the same table, sharing the same last name. The night of March 22, 2012 began the way thousands of ordinary nights begin in Wharton, Texas. Quietly, without ceremony, the unremarkable conclusion of an unremarkable day in a small town where nothing much happens. The Sesler family was home. The house on Avenue D sat in the dark Texas night as it always did. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from forensic evidence, from Trey's own statements to investigators, and from the physical aftermath that greeted first responders when they finally arrived. The picture that emerges is not one of sudden explosive rage, the kind of crime of passion that at least offers the cold comfort of being comprehensible. What happened was deliberate. It was methodical, it was planned. Trey Sesler used a rifle. He moved through the house with purpose. He shot his father first, then his mother, then his younger brother Mark. Each shot was not the act of a man who had momentarily lost his mind, but rather the act of someone executing a plan he had constructed with care over what investigators would later conclude was a significant period of time. The evidence suggested premeditation. This was not a snap decision made in a moment of blind fury. This was a project. The discovery of the bodies the following morning triggered an immediate law enforcement response. 3 people dead inside a family home. The eldest son, Trey, absent from the scene. Within hours, Trey Sesler was located and taken into custody without incident, a detail that investigators would later note as significant. He did not flee. He did not barricade himself. He surrendered almost as if he had been waiting to be found. When detectives began interviewing Trey in the hours following his arrest, what they heard confirmed their worst suspicions about premeditation, while simultaneously raising questions that the simple facts of the crime scene could not answer. Trey was calm. He was coherent. He was not exhibiting the signs of someone in the grip of a psychotic break or the aftermath of a rage-fueled explosion. He was someone who had done something terrible and had made a kind of peace with having done it. The community of Wharton reacted with the stunned, disoriented grief that small towns always produce in the face of sudden, intimate violence. People who had known the Seslers for years, who had watched Trey grow up, who had perhaps even glanced at his YouTube videos, struggled to reconcile the young man they thought they knew with the crime that had been committed. The cognitive dissonance was immense, and as news began to spread beyond Wharton, first to Houston media, then to Texas statewide coverage, then to national true crime and internet culture communities, a different kind of shock began to reverberate. Because people who had watched Mr. Anime's videos, who had subscribed to his channel, who had commented and debated in his comment sections, were now grappling with a particular horror unique to the digital age. They had known the killer. They had watched him. And they had no idea. Interrogation rooms have a particular quality of revelation. Stripped of the performance space that the outside world provides, stripped of the camera, the audience, the curated persona, people often speak truths they have never spoken aloud before. For Trey Sesler, the interrogation room became something like the YouTube confessional he had never quite been able to make, even as he filmed himself for years. What investigators extracted from Trey Sesler in the days following his arrest has been partially detailed through court documents, police reports, and journalism surrounding the case. What emerged was both clarifying and deeply troubling, and in some critical respects, more troubling for what it did not explain than for what it did. Trey acknowledged what he had done. He did not attempt to construct an alibi or redirect blame. He admitted to the shootings. But the explanation he offered for why he had committed them revealed something that transformed this case from a tragic family murder into something far more chilling. Trey Sesler had not only killed his family, he had killed his family as a preliminary act, a clearing of the runway, a step in a much larger plan that, had it proceeded as he intended, would have made the murders of James, Kathy, and Mark Sesler a footnote in a massacre of unimaginable scale. Investigators discovered that Trey had been planning a mass shooting, not inside his home, not against people he knew personally. He had been planning an attack at a local middle school, an institution full of children, teachers, and staff who had nothing to do with whatever grievances Trey Sesler had spent years accumulating. The plan was real. It was detailed. It was, by the accounts of investigators who reviewed the evidence, frighteningly advanced in its preparation. He had killed his family, according to his own statements, because he believed they would try to stop him. He had eliminated them to clear the path for what he really intended to do. The murders on Avenue D were not the act itself, they were the prologue. This revelation fundamentally recontextualized everything about the case. The family annihilation was catastrophic in its own right. 3 people murdered in their home by someone who should have protected them. But the murder of his family was, in Trey's own conception of events, instrumental. They were obstacles that needed removing. Law enforcement officials have subsequently described the intervention of Trey's arrest as having potentially prevented a mass casualty event. The timeline suggests that had Trey not been located and taken into custody when he was, the next day might have looked very different for the students and staff of a Wharton school. This is where the case of Trey Sesler breaks out of the conventional framework of family violence and becomes something larger and more disturbing, a near miss of catastrophic proportions wrapped inside a tragedy that had already claimed 3 lives. There is a peculiar horror in the almost, in the near miss, in the catastrophe that was averted not by brilliant investigation or timely intervention, but by the simple dumb luck of an arrest that happened to come before the next phase of a plan could be executed. The students of that Wharton Middle School went to class the day after Trey Sesler's arrest without knowing how close the calculus of that morning had come to being catastrophic. Many of them still don't know. Trey's plan, as reconstructed by investigators from his statements and from physical evidence recovered during the investigation, was not a vague fantasy. It was operational. He had thought about it. He had, in the manner of someone who had immersed himself for years in the research and documentation of real-world mass violence, considered the mechanics of what he intended to do. The weapons were there. The motivation, in the warped, self-justifying logic of someone who had spent years cultivating grievance, was there. The willingness to act, demonstrated so devastatingly inside his own home, was there. Investigators examining the case in the weeks and months following the arrest repeatedly emphasized in their statements to the press that the school attack plan was credible. This was not a revenge fantasy scribbled in a private journal. This was a plan that Trey Sesler had taken concrete steps toward executing. The family murders were, in his own framework, preparation. The question of why a middle school, why those particular students, those teachers, that institution, has never been fully answered in any public accounting of the case. That connection, if any specific connection existed, remains murky. This is one of the genuine unresolved dimensions of the Sesler case. The full internal logic of his targeting has never been explained in a way that satisfies the need for coherent motive. What is understood is the broader ideological and psychological framework within which Trey appeared to be operating. He had, in the months and possibly years leading up to the murders, become deeply immersed in the documented histories of mass violence. He had studied perpetrators. He had, by some accounts, expressed admiration for certain figures in that grim canon. The school attack plan fits within a pattern of ideation that researchers in this field have documented extensively. The escalating fantasy, the target selection, the preparation, the triggering event is not unprecedented. Criminologists who study mass violence have documented cases in which perpetrators eliminated family members before proceeding to a public attack, citing reasons ranging from not wanting to leave them behind to believing they might alert authorities. Trey's stated reasoning falls within this pattern. What it means, in the most direct and devastating terms, is that the death toll of this case, already 3 people who should be alive, could have been exponentially higher. That it was not is the only grace note in a story almost entirely devoid of them. Death Note, Attack on Titan, Code Geass. If you are familiar with anime, those titles carry weight. If you are not, let me offer you the relevant context. Each of those series, beloved by millions of fans worldwide, features protagonists or central figures who engage in mass killing, sometimes heroically, sometimes tragically, always with a kind of ideological justification that the narrative constructs around the violence. Characters who believe they are cleaning up the world. Characters who decide unilaterally that their judgment about who deserves to live supersedes every other consideration. Trey Sesler loved anime. He built his entire online identity around it, and investigators, in piecing together his psychology in the wake of the murders, spent considerable time examining the relationship between the content he consumed and the worldview he developed. The question they were wrestling with was one that media researchers have grappled with for decades. When does fiction stop being escapism and start being instruction? The answer, in most cases, is never. The overwhelming majority of anime fans, the millions of young people worldwide who love Death Note and Attack on Titan and Code Geass, do not commit violence. The research on media consumption and real-world behavior is clear on this point. Fictional content does not create killers, but what it can do, in certain already vulnerable individuals, is provide a framework, a language, a set of archetypes and justifications that a deteriorating mind can adopt and adapt. For Trey Sesler, the evidence suggests that the fictional worlds he inhabited through anime had become more real in a certain psychological sense than the actual world he was navigating. His YouTube videos in the months preceding the murders show a person who was increasingly framing his own situation in terms borrowed from the narratives he consumed, the sense of being a misunderstood genius, the conviction that the world was failing to recognize his worth, the romanticization of extreme action as a response to feeling trapped. These are not anime-specific pathologies. They are patterns that researchers have identified across a wide range of perpetrators of mass violence, regardless of their media consumption habits. But in Trey's case, the specific aesthetic and narrative vocabulary of anime appears to have given his deteriorating worldview a particular shape. His channel name, Mr. Anime, was not incidental. It was the identity he had chosen, the one that felt most true. And when investigators looked at the gap between that identity and the identity that committed 3 murders, they found that the gap was smaller than it should have been. The fictional world had been seeping into the real one for longer than anyone realized. This is not an argument against anime or against any art form. It is an observation about what happens when the protective membrane between fantasy and reality erodes in a mind that is already in crisis. And it is a reminder that what people consume, especially in intense, immersive ways, is never entirely without consequence for who they become. In the days following Trey Sesler's arrest, something remarkable and deeply unsettling happened across anime and YouTube fan communities online. People who had subscribed to Mr. Anime, who had left comments on his videos, who had debated him about favorite series and trading cards and fictional storylines, began to realize that they had unknowingly been watching something real unfold in real time. The reckoning was collective, and it was devastating. Forums lit up. Reddit threads appeared. Discord servers buzzed with the specific kind of horrified recognition that comes when something you thought you understood reveals itself to be something else entirely. Users began going back through Trey's old videos with new eyes, timestamp by timestamp, looking for what they had missed, and they found things. In retrospect, the signals were there, embedded in comments about fictional violence, in the edge of agitation, in his voice during certain vlogs, in the topics he returned to with slightly too much frequency. What followed was a form of collective self-examination that is specific to internet culture and largely unprecedented in the history of crime. His fans were not passive bystanders who had simply heard about someone violent on the news. They had interacted with him, they had been part of his world, and now they were asking themselves the question that no one in that situation ever wants to ask. Could I have known? Should I have said something? Did I at some level sense something was wrong and dismiss it? The answers that emerged were complicated. Some subscribers reported that certain videos had made them uncomfortable, that they had noticed an intensity that felt off, that they had considered leaving a concerned comment and then thought better of it. Others said they had seen nothing, that Mr. Anime had seemed right up until the end, like a perfectly ordinary if slightly intense young man talking about anime on the internet. The parasocial nature of YouTube relationships, the sense of knowing someone you have never met, the intimacy the creators cultivate with their audiences through direct address and personal revelation made the betrayal feel genuinely personal. People grieved. They expressed anger. They tried to make sense of how someone they felt they knew could have done something so incomprehensible. This community reckoning also triggered important conversations about online radicalization, about the responsibility platforms bear for content that signals deterioration, about whether comment sections and algorithmic recommendations played any role in reinforcing Trey's developing worldview. Those conversations were not fully resolved in 2012, and they are not fully resolved now. What the online community of Mr. Anime's fans experienced in the wake of March 22, 2012, was a preview of something that would become increasingly familiar in the years that followed. The discovery that someone who built a public presence online was simultaneously building something private and terrible in the darkness alongside it. When law enforcement searched the Sesler property and Trey's personal space in the aftermath of the murders, what they found was not the improvised desperation of someone who had snapped. It was something more organized, more deliberate, and far more frightening. The physical evidence told a story of extended preparation, of someone who had been moving toward a catastrophic destination for a long time, gathering the tools and knowledge he believed he would need. The weapons recovered were real and ready. Trey had access to firearms, which is not unusual in rural Texas, but takes on obvious significance given what he used them for and what he intended to do next. The state of the weapons, how they were maintained, how they were stored, the availability of ammunition, indicated someone who had been thinking practically about their use, not merely fantasizing. Beyond the weapons themselves, investigators found documentation, notes, research, evidence that Trey had spent significant time studying the mechanics of what he planned to do at the middle school. This was not a spontaneous decision triggered by something that happened in the days before the murders. The evidence suggested a planning horizon that stretched back months, possibly longer. The family murders were the final act of preparation, not the beginning of a crisis. The digital forensics component of the investigation was particularly revelatory. Trey's computer and online activity showed that he had been researching mass violence events in detail. He had studied what worked and what didn't, in the cold, analytical way of someone treating it as a problem to be solved rather than a horror to be avoided. He had consumed documentation of previous attacks with the same thoroughness he brought to his anime research. Investigators also found evidence suggesting that Trey had been documenting his own planning to some degree, creating a record of his thoughts and intentions in ways that went beyond his public YouTube content. The full extent of what was recovered from his personal records has not been completely disclosed publicly, and this is one of the dimensions of the case that continues to generate questions among researchers and true crime analysts. What can be said with confidence is that the totality of the evidence painted a picture of a person who had been living a double life for a significant period of time. The public self, Mr. Anime, the enthusiastic YouTuber from Texas, was real. The passion for anime was genuine. The desire for connection and recognition was sincere, but running alongside that public self, increasingly consuming it, was a private self building towards something that the public self never acknowledged and the people around him never detected. The weapon said, "I was ready." The note said, "I had been thinking about this for a long time." The digital evidence said, "I studied how to do this with the same discipline I brought to everything else." Together, they said something that law enforcement officials, investigators, and the people of Wharton, Texas found almost impossible to fully absorb. In the months following Trey Sesler's arrest and through the legal proceedings that followed, mental health professionals were brought in to do what the courts required and what the public desperately wanted: to explain him, to open the skull and show the machinery. To answer the question that every person who knew his name was asking: what kind of person does this, and how do you make sense of it? The psychological evaluations of Trey Sesler produced findings that were complex, contested, and, in the way that all psychological explanations of X-Tech, remake violence ultimately are insufficient to fully explain the inexplicable. Several diagnoses and diagnostic impressions were discussed in the context of the legal proceedings. The specifics of what was found, what was argued by defense versus prosecution-aligned mental health experts, and what ultimately influenced the court's determinations have been partially documented through case records and journalism. What emerged was a profile that combined elements that researchers in the field of targeted violence recognize immediately. Narcissistic injury, the profound wound inflicted on a sense of grandiose self that reality repeatedly fails to validate, appears to have been a significant factor. Trey had spent years building an identity as Mr. Anime, as a creator and personality deserving of recognition, and the gap between that self-image and his actual circumstances in Wharton, Texas, was widening in ways he found intolerable. This gap between the ideal self and the actual self is a documented feature in the psychology of a significant percentage of perpetrators of mass violence. There is also the question of what researchers call leakage, the way in which violent ideation tends to escape into observable behavior before it is acted upon. Trey's videos were, in retrospect, a form of extreme leakage. He was broadcasting his deterioration to an audience that didn't know how to read what it was seeing. What the psychological profile of Trey Sesler did not produce, what no psychological profile ever produces, despite the hopes of those who commissioned them, was a clean, simple, satisfying answer. Human beings are not reducible to diagnoses. Violence at this scale is not the output of a single broken component in an otherwise intact machine. It is the result of a particular combination of factors: psychological, social, environmental, circumstantial, homing together in a specific person at a specific moment in a specific context. What the profiles told us is that Trey Sesler was suffering, that his suffering had taken a particular shape that pointed toward violence, that the suffering was real, even if his response to it was monstrous, and that the systems that might have intervened, mental health services, community awareness, family recognition, online platform monitoring, all failed to catch what was building before it was too late. When the case of State of Texas versus James Albert Sesler III made its way through the Texas court system, it did so with the weight of 3 lives and the near miss of countless more, pressing down on every proceeding. The courtroom in Wharton County was not equipped for a national spectacle, and in many ways the trial unfolded with less of the media circus that cases of this nature sometimes generate. But for the community of Wharton, and for the extended community of people who had known Trey through his online presence, every development carried enormous weight. The central legal question was not whether Trey Sesler had committed the murders. He had admitted to them. The question was how the court would weigh the circumstances of the crime against the background of what the evidence revealed about his mental state, his intentions, and the full scope of what he had planned. The prosecution presented a case built on the premeditated, deliberate nature of the killings and the terrifying implications of the school attack plan. The defense engaged with the psychological evidence and the question of Trey's mental health at the time of the offense. One of the critical legal battlegrounds was the question of competency and culpability, the degree to which Trey's mental state affected his legal responsibility for what he had done. Texas law, like the laws of other states, has SPECT, IFICCA, IFIC frameworks for evaluating these questions, and the mental health testimony introduced during the proceedings addressed them directly. Family members of the victims, those who remained, navigated the impossible task of speaking about people they loved in the context of the worst thing that had happened to their family. People who had known Trey growing up tried to explain the young man they had known in contrast to the person the evidence described. The Wharton County community, present in the courtroom and watching through local media, was processing something that small communities rarely have to process: the knowledge that one of their own had committed not just a horrific act of family violence, but had nearly brought catastrophic violence to the schools where their children went every day. The near miss of the school attack hung over the proceedings like a second invisible crime. one that had not happened but had nearly happened and whose prevention felt, in retrospect, almost accidental. The outcome of the legal proceedings placed Trey Sesler in the Texas prison system for a sentence that reflected the gravity of 3 premeditated murders and the acknowledged intent to commit mass violence. He would spend a very long time, effectively his life in practical terms, behind bars in Texas. In the telling of dark stories, there was always the danger of centering the perpetrator at the expense of the people the perpetrator took. The case of Trey Sesler is no exception. His YouTube channel, his online persona, his psychological profile, his planning, his confession, all of these draw attention and analysis because they are, in the grim calculus of true crime storytelling, the elements that explain and contextualize the violence. But in centering Trey, we risk reducing his victims to footnotes in his story. .eta. I deserve more than that. James Sesler Jr. had lived his entire adult life in Wharton County. He had worked, raised a family, and built the kind of ordinary life that is its own form of achievement. He had opinions that sometimes clashed with his eldest son's ambitions. He was complicated, as all people are complicated. He was also a father who did not deserve to be shot in his own home by his own child. Whatever existed between them, whatever friction, whatever disappointment, whatever failure of understanding, it was the stuff of ordinary family life, not of the death penalty. James Sesler Jr. was owed more years. He had not finished living. Kathy Sesler was a mother, in the specific way that mothers of troubled children are mothers, with their love tangled up in fear and hope and a refusal to stop trying. Every account of Kathy describes a woman who kept showing up for her family even when showing up was hard. Who believed, perhaps longer than evidence warranted, that things could be better, that her son could find his way. Kathy Sesler was the kind of woman whose absence leaves a hole in the fabric of everyone who knew her. She was owed more years too. Mark Sesler was 19. Let that land for a moment. He was 19 years old. He had barely started. Whatever Mark would have become, whatever relationships he would have built, whatever work he would have done, whatever small and large contributions he would have made to the world, all of it died with him on a night in March when he had done nothing to deserve what came for him except to be in the wrong house, with the wrong brother, in the wrong moment of a family's unraveling. True crime stories owe their subjects this accounting. The violence gets the spotlight because it is what happened, and we cannot understand the case without looking at it directly. But the people it happened to, they are what matters. They are the reason this story needs to be told honestly and completely, with the weight of their absence always present. There is a thing that happens to small communities when they learn how close they came to a catastrophe that did not materialize. It is different from the grief of an event that actually occurred. It is a specific, haunting form of knowledge, the awareness of the alternative timeline, the one in which the arrest did not come when it did, in which the school day of March 23, 2012 unfolded the way Trey Sesler had planned it. Communities that carry this knowledge carry it quietly, because there are no appropriate words for grief over something that did not happen, even when the knowledge of how close it came is as heavy as any actual loss. Wharton, Texas carries this knowledge. The parents of children who attended that middle school carry it. The teachers and staff who reported to work on the days surrounding Trey's arrest carry it. Some of them, perhaps without ever knowing the specific nature of what had been planned against them. The community's relationship with the Sesler case is therefore doubled. The confirmed reality of 3 people murdered on Avenue D, and the unconfirmed but documented reality of what had been intended next. In the aftermath of the case, the conversation in Wharton was forced to confront questions that most small towns prefer not to think about. Questions about awareness, about whether the signs of someone's deterioration can be seen by the people around them if they know what to look for. Questions about access to weapons. Questions about the relationship between online behavior and real-world danger. Questions about what community actually means when someone who lives within it is building toward violence and no one around them knows. The school in question, which was never publicly attacked, which continued. Its ordinary operations in the days that followed, whose students went on to graduate and build lives, became, in a strange and private way, a kind of monument to the near miss. Not a monument anyone erected or publicly acknowledged. A monument in the awareness of those who knew what had been planned, and who understood that the ordinary morning of March 23, 2012 was ordinary only because of a series of events that could easily have gone differently. If there is something to be taken from the near-miss dimension of this case, something that goes beyond the horror of what it almost was, it is this: the intervention worked. The arrest, the investigation, the taking into custody of a person whose plan had been building for months, it worked. It is cold comfort against the 3 lives that were lost. But it is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything for the children who went to school that next morning and came home safely. In 2012, YouTube was already the dominant video platform on the internet. It had been acquired by Google 6 years earlier. It had hundreds of millions of users. It was the place where a significant portion of the world's online video content lived, was discovered, and was consumed. And for years before March 22, 2012, it had been hosting the channel of Mr. Anime, a creator whose videos, when reviewed in retrospect, contained signals of violent ideation that any sufficiently attentive observer might have flagged. The question of platform responsibility in the Sesler case is not simple, and it should not be treated as simple. YouTube in 2012 did not have the sophisticated content moderation systems that platforms have developed in subsequent years. Partially in response to cases exactly like this one, the flagging mechanisms were primitive. The understanding of what constituted dangerous content was in its infancy, and the sheer volume of content being uploaded every minute made manual review of individual channels an impossibility without specific triggers. None of that, however, fully resolves the question, because Trey's videos were not buried in obscurity, they were watched. They had subscribers and comment sections and engagement. They were part of the ecosystem that YouTube was actively building and profiting from, and yet nothing in that ecosystem produced an intervention. What would an intervention have even looked like? This is where the analysis becomes genuinely difficult. Trey's videos did not contain explicit calls for violence, direct threats, or the kind of content that any 2012-era content policy would have identified as actionable. What they contained was subtler, the accumulation of signals that only make sense in retrospect when the outcome is already known. The challenge of identifying pre-violent ideation in online content is one that platforms, researchers, and law enforcement have been working on seriously since the mid-2010s. The field of online threat assessment has grown substantially, driven in part by cases like Trey Sesler's that demonstrated both the potential and the failure of early warning systems in digital spaces. YouTube has, in the years since 2012, implemented increasingly sophisticated systems for identifying and removing violent content, for connecting at-risk users with mental health resources, and for working with law enforcement on cases involving credible threats. The development has been reactive rather than proactive, shaped by disasters rather than preventing them. But it represents progress that can be measured in the cases that are identified and intercepted before violence occurs. The Sesler case is now taught in certain contexts as an example of what can be missed. Not as an indictment of any individual or organization, the failure was Mike, not personal, but as a lesson in the gap between what a digital platform can observe and what it can understand about what it is observing. The killing of an entire family by one of its members is not a phenomenon unique to the internet age or to small-town Texas or to anime fans. Family annihilation, the term criminologists use for the murder of an entire family unit, typically by the father or eldest male member, is a pattern with deep historical roots, documented across cultures and centuries, and studied with particular intensity in the last several decades as researchers have attempted to understand its causes and prevent its recurrence. Researchers who study family annihilation have identified several recurring typologies. The most common involves a father who kills his family in the context of perceived humiliation, financial ruin, relationship collapse, or the sense that he is about to lose everything that defines his identity and status. This type often involves what researchers call altruistic reasoning, a warped belief that the family is better off dead than facing the shame or hardship that is coming. Trey Sesler's case does not fit neatly into this typology. He was not the patriarch of a failing household trying to prevent imminent loss. He was an adult son, and his stated reasons, eliminating family members who might interfere with his broader plan, place him in a different and arguably even more disturbing category: the person who kills family not as a response to personal crisis, but as a preparatory act for intended public violence. This category of family annihilation, the pre-attack clearing, has been documented in a number of mass violence cases and represents one of the most chilling behavioral patterns in the research literature. It transforms the family not just into victims, but into obstacles, into objects to be managed and vice of a larger goal. Criminologists who have reviewed the Sesler case have noted the degree to which it fits within a broader typology of perpetrators who commit violence at home before moving to a public target. The specificity of Trey's stated reasons, his belief that his family would stop him, is consistent with the reasoning that other perpetrators in this category have offered when their plans were intercepted. Understanding family annihilation as a pattern does not make any individual case less horrifying. It does not explain away the specific tragedy of James, Kathy, and Mark Sesler. What it does is locate that tragedy within a larger landscape of human violence that researchers are working to understand and prevent. Every case that is studied, every pattern that is identified, is material for the development of better early warning systems, better interventions, better chances of stopping the next one before it starts. Before the phrase online radicalization was a staple of mainstream journalism, before platform content moderation was a subject of congressional hearings, before the relationship between internet culture and real-world violence was analyzed with the rigor it now receives, cases like Trey Sesler's were performing the brutal work of education. The case of Mr. Anime did not create these conversations, but it contributed to them as a data point, as a cautionary example, as evidence that the gap between digital persona and dangerous reality could be vast and deadly. In the years since 2012, the conversation about online warning signs has matured considerably. The concept of leakage, the behavioral theory that most people who commit targeted violence leave detectable warning signs in the period before the act, has been refined and operationalized by behavioral threat assessment professionals. A specific dimension of online leakage, the way in which social media and content creation platforms provide unprecedented windows into the mental states of people who might otherwise leave no detectable trace, has become a major focus of research and practice. Trey Sesler's case is cited in professional threat assessment training as an example of documented pre-attack leakage that was not identified in real time. The retrospective clarity of his videos, the way in which going back with knowledge of the outcome, the signals seem almost undeniable, is used to illustrate both the possibility of detection and the difficulty of it. It is easy to see what Trey was building when you already know what he built. It is much harder to see it in real time. Internet communities of the type Trey inhabited have also changed in response to the accumulated evidence of cases like his. Anime and gaming communities have developed more sophisticated internal awareness of the difference between dark humor as a genre convention and dark ideation as a symptom. Community members are more likely now to flag concerning behavior to moderators, or in serious cases, to law enforcement. The platforms themselves have changed, driven by a combination of regulatory pressure, public scrutiny, and internal recognition that the consequences of an action can be severe. The legacy of Mr. Anime's channel is not a comfortable one, but it is a real one. The videos of Trey Sesler, preserved in the documentary record of the internet age, are a monument to the cost of missed warning signs. And they are, for those willing to look, a lesson in what to look for. In the weeks and months following the murders, Wharton, Texas did what small communities always do in the aftermath of tragedy. It tried to hold itself together. It organized vigils. It offered condolences through the networks of church and neighborhood and shared history that holds small towns intact when the ground shifts beneath them. It processed, collectively and individually, the specific horror of having had this happen here, in this town, on this street, in this family that people knew. The healing of a community after an event like this is not a clean, linear process. There is no endpoint at which grief resolves into acceptance and the wound closes over. What happens is more like accommodation, the gradual development of a relationship with the fact of what occurred that allows daily life to continue alongside the awareness of it. Several people from Wharton who knew the Sesler family, speaking in various contexts over the years since the case, have described the particular difficulty of holding two simultaneous truths, that they knew Trey and that Trey did this. The cognitive work required to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the act he committed is, they have said, ongoing. It does not resolve. You learn to live with the unresolved quality of it. For the teachers and students of the middle school that was nearly targeted, the psychological dimension is different but no less significant. Living with the knowledge of a near miss, knowing that the morning you went to school was ordinary only because of the timing of an arrest, is its own form of trauma. There are people in Wharton today, people who graduated from that middle school, who grew up 2 streets from the Sesler house, who remember seeing Trey at the grocery store or the gas station, who carry this case as part of the background of their lives. It has shaped them in ways both visible and invisible. It is the event that happened here, the thing that reminded Wharton that it is not protected from the darkest things that can happen to a community simply because it is small and quiet and ordinary. Wharton healed the way communities always heal, imperfectly, incompletely, stubbornly. It is still healing. It will, in certain ways, always be healing. Texas prison is not the end of a story. It is, in the specific way of incarceration, a kind of extended coda. a continuation of existence under radically different terms, stripped of almost everything that gave the preceding life its texture and agency. For Trey Sesler, who committed his crimes at 22 and entered the Texas Department of Criminal Justice as a young man with decades of life still ahead of him, prison represents the definitive foreclosure of one version of the future and the beginning of a profoundly diminished version of another. What has been reported about Trey Sesler's time in prison comes largely from the few accounts that have filtered out through court filings, brief journalistic inquiries, and occasional communication through legal channels. The picture that emerges is of someone who has continued to exist, to think, to process what he did and what it means, without the ability to reach the outside world in any meaningful way. There have been reports, unverified and difficult to confirm, that Trey has expressed remorse in various contexts. The nature and sincerity of such remorse is, of course, impossible to evaluate from the outside. The question of whether a person who commits crimes of this nature is capable of genuine remorse, as opposed to the performance of remorse in a context where performing it serves a purpose, is one that psychologists and philosophers have debated at length without reaching consensus. What is not in question is that the person incarcerated in Texas is the same person who built Mr. Anime's channel, who grew up in Wharton, who filmed himself talking about anime with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. The continuity of personhood is a philosophically thorny question in cases of extreme violence. Whether he thinks about the channel, whether he thinks about his subscribers and the community he built and then destroyed, whether he thinks about the school he planned to attack and the children who will never know how close they came, these are questions that no one outside the walls can answer. They are part of the unresolved interior of a case that has too many unresolved dimensions to count. Every major crime case has its residue, the questions that the investigation and the trial and the sentencing do not fully answer. The questions that researchers, analysts, journalists, and ordinary people continue to turn over in the years after the legal proceedings are complete. The Sesler case has an unusually rich residue of this kind. The most fundamental unresolved question is also the most difficult. Why the school? What was the specific grievance, if any, that made the middle school in Wharton the target of Trey's planned attack? Mass violence researchers have consistently found that targeting is rarely random. Perpetrators choose their targets for reasons that are meaningful to them, even if those reasons are incomprehensible to others. But the specific logic of Trey's target selection has never been publicly explained in a way that satisfies the need for coherent motive. A second unresolved question concerns the timing and the trigger. What made March 22, 2012 the night? Was there a specific event that accelerated a plan that might otherwise have unfolded differently? Was there a final provocation, a last straw, a confrontation, or a disappointment that moved the timeline forward? Or was the timing purely logistical? Third, and perhaps most troubling from a research perspective, what was the full extent of the documentation that Trey had created about his plans? The complete picture of what he wrote, what he recorded, what digital traces he left of his planning process, this has never been fully made public. Fourth, who else knew and how much did they know? Were there people in his life, online or in Wharton, who had information that, in retrospect, should have alarmed them? Did anyone have a conversation with him that contained signals they rationalized away? These unresolved questions are not academic. They are the difference between a case that is understood and a case that is learned from. Every gap in our understanding of what happened is a gap in our ability to prevent the next version of it. There is a reason that the case of Trey Sesler resonates beyond the specific facts of what happened in Wharton, Texas in March of 2012. The case is not just a tragedy, it is a mirror, and what it reflects is not comfortable to look at. We live in an age in which the construction and maintenance of public digital identity has become ordinary, not just for YouTubers and influencers and content creators, but for almost everyone navigating modern social life. We curate what we share. We present particular versions of ourselves to particular audiences. We craft personas that reflect how we want to be seen rather than necessarily who we are. This is not pathological, it is normal. It is, in many respects, what human social life has always required. The management of presentation, the negotiation between private reality and public image, but the digital age has amplified this process to a scale and intensity that is historically unprecedented. The gap between who we are and who we present ourselves to be is now potentially observable to thousands or millions of people simultaneously. And when that gap is not just the ordinary friction of social performance, but something genuinely dangerous, the implications are serious. Trey Sesler's case asks us to think about this gap in its most extreme form. Here was someone whose public persona was genuinely engaging, genuinely appealing, genuinely connective. And running alongside that public self, hidden from the audience he was cultivating, was a private self building toward catastrophic violence. The two selves coexisted for years, in public, visible to anyone who was paying attention. The question the case puts to us, as consumers of online content, as members of internet communities, as participants in the digital ecosystem that platforms like YouTube have created, is whether we can get better at noticing when the gap is there. Not as surveillance, not as the transformation of content consumption into a monitoring exercise, but as a kind of literacy, the ability to read the subtle signals that distinguish the ordinary performance of self that we all engage in from the specific distress and danger that some cases represent. One of the most disturbing dimensions of any high-profile violence case is the question of contagion, the documented phenomenon by which certain perpetrators and acts inspire imitation among others who are vulnerable to the same patterns of ideation. Researchers have established beyond reasonable doubt that mass violence can be contagious in specific, measurable ways. The case of Trey Sesler sits in a particular position within this landscape. He was not a mass casualty perpetrator. His school attack was prevented, and his crimes, while devastating, did not produce the kind of spectacular body count that tends to generate the most contagion risk. But he was a YouTube creator with a community which gave his case a specific resonance within internet culture that more conventional violence cases do not carry. In the years following the Sesler case, researchers and online community monitors noted instances of individuals within anime and YouTube communities who referenced Mr. Anime in concerning ways, who expressed a kind of dark admiration for what he represented, who discussed his case in terms that indicated identification rather than horror. The full extent of this influence is difficult to quantify. What can be said is that the case entered the mythology of a certain dark corner of internet culture, the collection of cases and perpetrators that attract obsessive attention from individuals who are themselves troubled and searching for frameworks for their own distress. The online communities where this mythology circulates are monitored by law enforcement threat assessment units, academic researchers, and platform trust and safety teams. This is why responsible true crime coverage of cases like Trey Sesler's keeps the victims at the center. Why it names James, Kathy, and Mark with the same care and detail it gives to the perpetrator. Why it refuses to treat the violence as spectacle and instead treats it as evidence of something that needs to be understood in order to be prevented. The goal is not to create the next Mr. Anime. The goal is to make sure there never is one. The field of behavioral threat assessment, the systematic evaluation of whether a particular individual poses a credible risk of targeted violence, has existed in various forms since the 1990s, when the Secret Service and the FBI began studying the backgrounds of individuals who had attacked public figures in order to develop predictive frameworks. The Sesler case arrived at a pivotal moment in the development of this field, just as researchers and practitioners were beginning to grapple seriously with the implications of social media and online content creation for threat assessment. Before platforms like YouTube became ubiquitous, the behavioral signals that preceded targeted violence were largely private: journal entries, conversations with acquaintances, observable behavioral changes. With social media, some of those signals became public. The theoretical promise of this development was enormous. If perpetrators of targeted violence routinely leave warning signs, and the research consistently demonstrates that they do, and if those warning signs are now potentially visible in public online content, then the tools for early detection should be dramatically improved. The Sesler case demonstrated devastatingly the gap between that theoretical promise and the practical reality. In the years since, threat assessment professionals have developed more sophisticated frameworks specifically for evaluating online content as a source of pre-attack behavioral evidence. The Sesler case features prominently in several of these frameworks as an example of documented pre-attack online leakage that was not identified in real time. The refinement of threat assessment methodology, driven in part by cases like Trey Sesler's, means that the systems we have now are meaningfully better than they were in 2012. Not perfect, not sufficient, but better. And better, in the business of preventing mass violence, translates directly into lives saved. Among the most psychologically complex and disturbing elements of the Sesler case is the specific nature of why he killed his family. Not because of rage at them personally, though there is evidence of long-standing friction, but because he perceived them as obstacles to a larger plan. The killing of family members as preparatory to a planned public attack is not a unique feature of the Sesler case, but it is relatively rare, and the specific reasoning Trey offered, the belief that his family would have tried to stop him, reveals something important about how his mind was operating. He had, at some point in the evolution of his planning, ceased to experience his parents and brother as people with their own inner lives, their own claims on existence, their own futures that mattered. They had become, in the internal logic of his plan, variables in an equation. Psychologists who study this phenomenon have noted that it requires a specific and extreme form of cognitive distancing from the humanity of the people being killed. Normal human beings experience powerful inhibitions against harming family members. These inhibitions are deeply rooted in attachment, in empathy, in the shared history that makes family relationships uniquely personal. To overcome these inhibitions sufficiently to commit murder requires a process of gradual dehumanization that erodes them over time. In Trey's case, the evidence points toward exactly that. The psychological distance between him and his family members appears to have been building over a long period, fed by the frustrations and resentments that had accumulated over years of living in a household where his identity and ambitions were, at least in his perception, undervalued and misunderstood. Understanding those factors and distinguishing them from the ordinary grievances of ordinary family life is one of the central challenges of violence prevention. The dehumanization that led to the murders on Avenue D was not built overnight. It was assembled piece by piece over years. Somewhere in that process, there were moments when a different outcome was still possible. There is a specific psychological architecture to the minds of people who commit targeted violence, a structure of thought and feeling that researchers have documented across enough cases to recognize as a pattern. At its center in virtually every case is what scholars call the grievance narrative, the story a person tells themselves about why the world has failed them, who is responsible for that failure, and what justice would look like. Everyone has grievances. Everyone has experienced unfairness, disappointment, failure, the gap between what they hoped for and what they received. These experiences are universal, what transforms ordinary grievance into the organizing principle of a violent worldview is a combination of factors: the intensity and breadth of the grievance, the rigidity with which it is held, the extent to which it shapes identity, and the degree to which it is paired with the belief that the people responsible for the grievance deserve to suffer for it. Trey Sesler's grievance narrative had several components: the failure of his YouTube career to achieve the scale he believed he deserved, the sense of being trapped in Wharton, the perception that his family did not adequately value or support his ambitions, the broader feeling of being misunderstood and underappreciated by a world that he believed owed him more than it was providing. None of these grievances were in themselves extraordinary. Millions of people feel versions of exactly these things. The difference between those millions of people and Trey Sesler was not the presence of grievance. It was what he chose to do with it. Researchers who study the grievance to violence pathway have identified several factors that predict escalation from grievance to action. One is the absence of corrective relationships. Relationships that provide reality testing, that challenge distorted thinking, that offer alternative perspectives. Another is the development of a last resort orientation, the conviction that violence is the only remaining option. A third is the identification of specific targets on whom the violence can be focused. Trey Sesler's case exhibits all of these factors in abundance. In the aftermath of virtually every act of targeted violence, the people who knew the perpetrator face a particular form of social interrogation. The community tries to construct a narrative that makes sense of how someone they knew could have done something so incomprehensible. The Wharton community's experience of this interrogation was complicated by the particular intimate of small-town knowledge. In a city of millions, you can know someone without really knowing them. In Wharton, Texas, with its 8,000 residents and the dense social web of small community life, the people who had encountered Trey Sesler throughout his life had something closer to real knowledge of him, which made the question of whether they should have seen this coming more pointed. The honest answer, the one that emerges from careful examination of the evidence rather than the instinct to find fault and assign blame, is nuanced. There were probably individuals in Trey's life who had seen things that, properly evaluated, should have raised concerns. There were probably moments of awareness, of discomfort, of something seeming off, that were dismissed or explained away. But there is also the reality that recognizing pre-violent ideation requires knowledge and training that most ordinary community members do not have. The average neighbor seeing something slightly concerning does not have a reliable framework for distinguishing ordinary eccentricity from genuine danger. They are working without a roadmap. This is why the field of community-based threat assessment has developed specific training programs for teachers, coaches, counselors, parents, and other community members who are often in the best position to observe early warning signs. The silence of the neighbor is rarely malicious or negligent in any meaningful moral sense. It is usually the silence of someone who didn't know what they were seeing, who wasn't sure their concern was worth acting on. Filling that silence with education, with frameworks, with community systems is one of the practical implications of the lesson that cases like this one teach. The anime fan community of 2012 was, in many respects, still in the process of establishing its cultural identity in the broader America landscape. Long stigmatized as a niche interest associated with social awkwardness, the community had in the preceding decade experienced significant mainstream growth and the beginning of genuine cultural acceptance. Into this moment of community growth and evolving identity, the Sesler case landed like a stone in still water. The ripples extended in several directions simultaneously, touching different parts of the community in different ways, and generating responses that ranged from grief and horror to defensiveness and denial. The grief and horror were the most straightforward response, a community discovering that one of its visible members had done something monstrous. The parasocial relationships that YouTube enables meant that many of Trey's subscribers felt something like personal betrayal, the specific hurt of having trusted someone who turned out to be something other than what you thought you knew. The defensiveness was predictable but worth examining. The anime community's history of stigma, the long association in American mainstream culture between anime fandom and social dysfunction, created real anxiety about how the Sesler case would be used to reinforce that stigma. Would the media coverage reduce his crimes to anime made him do it? Would the community suffer renewed association with the violence it categorically rejected? What the anime community's response ultimately demonstrated was the same thing that every community demonstrates when confronted with the crimes of a member: the inadequacy of collective identity as a framework for individual behavior. Communities do not commit crimes. Individuals do. The response that the community should model, and that many thoughtful members did model, was not defensiveness, but engagement. A serious adult confrontation with the question of what it means to notice when someone in your community is in distress. If you map the trajectory of Trey Sesler's life from childhood in Wharton to the night of March 22, 2012, the map would be dotted with what researchers call decision points, moments at which a different choice, by Trey or by someone in his life or by one of the systems he moved through, might have produced a different outcome. The most proximate intervention point was in the period immediately preceding the murders, the window during which Trey's plan was fully developed and he was moving toward execution. A clinician with access to him during this period, equipped with proper threat assessment training, would almost certainly have identified risk factors warranting intervention, but no clinician had access. The period went unmonitored. Further back, the intervention possibilities multiply. At some point earlier in the development of his violent ideation, at some point when the grievance narrative was still being constructed, before it had hardened into absolute certainty, there would have been opportunities for what researchers call off-ramps. Pathways away from the trajectory he was on, therapeutic engagement, meaningful community connection, achievement that validated his sense of himself in ways that didn't require the resolution of violence. Earlier still, in adolescence and young adulthood, the isolation that characterized Trey's school years. The failure of community institutions to create genuine belonging for a young man whose interests set him apart from his peers. The absence of adult mentorship of the specific kind that can provide corrective relationships for developing minds. None of this is to say that Trey's violence was inevitable before it happened. It was not. People with every element of his background make different choices every day. But the existence of intervention points is not academic. It is the practical toolkit for our prevention, and every case that is studied thoroughly, every map of every trajectory, is material for building better, earlier, more effective tools for the next one. One of the defining features of the internet age is that it creates records that persist. The things you post, the content you create, the words you write in public digital spaces, these do not disappear when circumstances change. They remain archived by platforms or by individual users who capture screenshots and downloads, accessible to anyone who knows where to look. For Trey Sesler, it created a digital footprint that has taken on a life of its own in the decade plus since his crimes. Mr. Anime's videos, or some subset of them, exist in various states of accessibility on the internet. Some have been officially removed from platforms. Others were captured before removal by users who shared them in true crime communities and archival spaces. The question of whether these videos should be accessible is genuinely complicated. On one hand, they have genuine research and educational value. For threat assessment professionals, for researchers studying online radicalization, for journalists covering the intersection of internet culture and violence, The documentary record of Mr. Anime's channel is primary source material of a type that simply doesn't exist for most historical cases of targeted violence. On the other hand, the continued circulation of those videos carries risks. The romanticization of Trey Sesler in certain online spaces, the treatment of his case as something to be celebrated rather than mourned and learned from, is facilitated by the accessibility of his content. What is clear is that the digital footprint of Trey Sesler is permanent in a way that the footprints of most historical violent offenders are not. Future researchers will have access to his videos, his comments, his online interactions in extraordinary detail. That access is both opportunity and responsibility. The obligation of everyone who engages with that material is to engage with it in a way that serves the goal of understanding and prevention rather than sensation and spectacle. To truly understand the Sesler case, it is necessary to locate it within the broader landscape of family annihilation cases that criminologists have studied. These comparisons are essential for the specific analytical purpose of identifying what was unique about Trey's case and what was part of a recognizable pattern. The most studied type of family annihilation, the financially ruined or romantically abandoned patriarch who kills his family before killing himself, bears some surface resemblance to the Sesler case, but differs in critical ways. The classic Annihilator is acting from a place of perceived catastrophic loss. The violence is, in his twisted logic, protective. The Sesler case inverts this logic. Trey was not eliminating his family to protect them from coming hardship. He was eliminating them to remove obstacles from his path. The closer parallel is with perpetrators who commit family violence before proceeding to a public attack, a pattern that researchers have documented in multiple mass violence cases. In these cases, the family violence is not the primary act, but the preparatory one, and the psychology is characterized by something cold and calculated, an instrumental relationship to violence, in which people become means to an end. The Sesler case also invites comparison with cases involving perpetrators who built public personas while simultaneously harboring violent plans. This pattern, while extreme, is well documented. It points toward the specific psychological capacity for compartmentalization, the ability to maintain simultaneously two completely different internal worlds. What distinguishes the Sesler case from many of its closest parallels is the specific medium of his public persona. The YouTube channel created a form of documented public-private split that is different from anything that existed before the social media age. Previous perpetrators who maintained public personas while planning violence left fragmentary evidence of their inner lives. Trey left hours of video. This difference in documentation density is, for researchers, an extraordinary resource. In the study of any tragedy, any event that unfolds over time and culminates in irreversible harm, there is an almost irresistible human instinct to search for the turning point, the moment at which things could still have gone differently. The last exit before the road led where it led. People search for this moment because it carries a particular kind of comfort, the suggestion that the disaster was not inevitable. For the Sesler case, the search for the turning point is complicated by incomplete information, filtered through the retrospective lens of known outcomes, and shaped by the limitations of what investigation and prosecution documented versus what actually occurred in the private space of Trey Sesler's developing mind. There are candidates for the turning point. Moments that, in retrospect, stand out as particularly significant. The period when his YouTube channel's growth stagnated, when the recognition he was seeking failed to materialize at the scale he had imagined. The period when whatever remained of his corrective relationships within the family apparently broke down irreversibly. The period when, by the internal evidence of his videos, the tone and content shifted in ways that now seem unmistakably ominous. But the honest answer to whether there was a turning point, a single identifiable moment at which the trajectory changed, is probably no. Or rather, there were multiple turning points, none of them individually decisive, accumulating over time into a trajectory that pointed in only one direction. This is how violence of this kind almost always develops, not as a single catastrophic decision, but as the terminal destination of a long, gradual process. Preventing outcomes like the one in Wharton, Texas requires not a single intervention at a single turning point, but sustained attention across multiple turning points, sustained engagement with the trajectory as it develops, sustained willingness to ask uncomfortable questions long before the answers become devastating. Before we arrive at the final dimensions of this story, before we close the file on the case of Trey Sesler in whatever incomplete way a case like this can ever be closed, it is necessary to return one more time to the people at the center of what happened, to James, to Kathy, to Mark. James Sesler Jr. deserved to grow old. He deserved to see his sons build whatever lives they were going to build. He deserved the ordinary passage of time that most people take for granted, the accumulation of years, of small moments, of the unremarkable forward motion of a life in progress. He deserved the chance to reconcile with his eldest son, or to reach whatever accommodation with that relationship's complications was possible, in the way that families in conflict sometimes do over years and decades if they are given the time. He was not given the time. Kathy Sesler deserved the same. She deserved to keep being a mother, to watch her children navigate adulthood, to be the person they called when things went wrong, to hold the particular position in a family that mothers hold for their entire lives if they are allowed to live them. She had not finished being needed. She had not finished the work of love and worry that defines motherhood for as long as it lasts. It was taken from her, in her own home, without warning. Mark Sesler, 19 years old, deserved decades, the kind of decades in which a person figures out who they are, what they care about, whom they love, the kind of decades that produce regrets and recoveries and the accumulated wisdom of a life actually lived. He was 19, which means he was barely at the beginning of knowing himself. Whatever he would have become, and there is no way to know which is its own form of grief, he would have become it without anyone getting to witness it. The story of Trey Sesler is the story of what he did, and why and how and what it cost. But the story underneath the story, the one that gives the facts their full moral weight, is the story of three people who deserved more. That story is not complete. It is not solvable. It is simply the truth, standing alongside everything else, insisting on being seen. More than a decade after the murders in Wharton, Texas, the case of Trey Sesler continues to attract serious professional attention. Not sensational attention, but the sustained, methodical attention of people whose professional work involves understanding how violence develops and how it can be prevented. Part of what keeps them returning is the documentation. The digital record of Mr. Anime's channel provides a kind of evidence base that most comparable cases simply cannot offer. Every framework for identifying pre-attack leakage, every model for detecting escalating violent ideation in online content can be tested against Trey's videos with the benefit of knowing the outcome. Another reason researchers keep returning is the combination of elements the case contains. Family annihilation, plus planned mass casualty event, plus averted secondary attack. This particular combination of factors is unusual enough that the Sesler case occupies a unique position in the research literature. The case also keeps being cited in policy discussions. Whenever conversations arise about platform responsibility for pre-attack content, the Sesler case appears. Whenever debates emerge about threat assessment in educational settings, about the monitoring of online communities for concerning behavior, the Sesler case appears. It has become, in the grim vocabulary of policy discussion, a reference point. What the sustained professional attention tells us is that the Sesler case has not been solved in the deeper sense, that the questions it raises about detection, prevention, and intervention remain live and unresolved. The murders of James, Kathy, and Mark Sesler cannot be undone. But if the study of what happened to them produces better frameworks for preventing the next version of this story, if even one family survives because of something learned from their tragedy, then their deaths will have contributed something to the world beyond the grief of those who love them. You have spent time with this story. You have walked through the details, the YouTube channel, the small town, the three people who deserved more, the near miss that still haunts a community, the questions that have not been answered and may never be. You have given this story the serious attention it deserves. And now, as we close, I want to talk to you directly about what that means. You are not just a passive consumer of true crime content. You are a person with a community, a network of relationships and connections, digital and physical, that gives you reach and influence that you may not always think of in those terms. You have friends and family members and coworkers and neighbors and followers and people who know your name and trust your judgment. And some of those people, more than you might think, are carrying things they haven't told anyone. The story of Trey Sesler is not just a true crime case. It is a case study in what happens when warning signs are missed, when the people who might have intervened either didn't know what they were seeing, didn't know what to do with what they saw, or didn't have access to the information that would have made action possible. It is a case about the cost of the gaps in our awareness and our systems and our communities. Sharing this story is not about sensation. It is not about generating views or building an algorithm or satisfying a dark curiosity. It is about making sure that more people have access to the information this case contains, about what warning signs look like, about what platforms can and cannot catch, about what communities can do when they pay attention. If you know someone whose behavior has been changing in ways that concern you, someone who is increasingly isolated, increasingly focused on grievance, increasingly drawn to violent themes in ways that feel different from entertainment, please take that concern seriously. Please reach out to them or to someone who can. The research is clear. Most people who commit targeted violence leave observable warning signs. Seeing those signs and acting on them is how we save lives. If what you have heard today has moved you, if the names James, Kathy, and Mark mean something to you now that they might not have an hour ago, then carry those names with you. Let them be part of how you move through your communities, your online spaces, your relationships. Let them be a reminder that the people around us are real, that their stories matter, and that attention, genuine, sustained, compassionate attention, is one of the most powerful tools we have for preventing the next story that should never have to be told. Subscribe if this kind of serious, honest storytelling is something you want more of. Leave a comment with what this case brought up for you. Share with someone who needs to hear it. And in the days that follow, stay present in your communities. The best memorial for James, Kathy, and Mark Sesler is a world that learns to see the warning signs before it's too late.